Hey, this is Travis Gafford, the double lift expert, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
This is episode 40 of Narrative Wake, and the guest for this one is going to be Travis Gafford, formerly T-Nomad. In some people's hearts, still T-Nomad. Like, here's the thing. We actually did plan a while back, this is years back now, to have an episode of Someone in Insight where you were going to come on, Travis. And it's not any sort of to be perceived slight that never happened, because if anyone actually watched Someone in Insight in the last year, I think we might have done like 7 episodes in the whole year. Like it very much fell away from that whole like once a week format, you know. So I mean, part of it, you know, once he was owning a team and then like moving between, I think he'd actually already started doing Overwatch for like OGN at the same time that he did LCK. So he had some like ridiculous schedule. And then he also got to that point that casters do get to, where when they've been overworked, they like basically, this is like one thing I learned actually from knowing a few casters, is like no one really is supposed to talk that much in their life, basically. So what happens is when you talk like 4 or 5 hours a day, and especially when you're trying to put like emphasis in your words, you eventually get to that. When you go to a doctor with a sore throat, he just tells you like, yeah, stop doing that. And you're like,
yeah, it's a health issue.
But that's my job. And then they just say like, well, just try not to talk when you're not at that place then. So what you end up with is people who just say, yeah, I'd love to do loads of content. Oh, I can't do any content. I can only do all this casting. You're like, sound, brilliant. Thanks, guys. Thanks. I'll just keep doing it all myself and never go to the doctor, shall I? So anyway, the lesson there is don't trust doctors. Just maybe go to like a homeopathist or something. He'll give you 1 drop of elderflower in some water and you'll be good to go. And you can cast and do all the content you need.
I never expected my intro to be so much about homeopathic medicine, but I appreciate the introduction.
No, well, you know, I mean, what would you have to do with the faint whiff of bullshit?
Yes.
That some people think's good. Yeah, there we go. So, don't know. Listen.
Great start, as always.
There we go. So, okay, here's the thing, Travis. People are already wondering, right? This is why people would think we wouldn't do an episode. People are thinking, right, especially Narrative Wake, like we have very much dispensed with a lot of the more lighthearted banter, and we have gone very much into the meat of like analysis, people just giving 10-minute rambles, but not even about abstract stuff, like things that happen to me in settings that have nothing to do with the game. Actually stuff about the game and the meta and like champions picked. And I know at some point in time, people's eyes sort of glaze over and then they wait for like a trigger word, like Cloud9. Then they come back out like, oh, I know Cloud9, yeah. And then they come back out of it. So people are probably going to wonder, what are we going to do in this episode? But there is actually so much stuff you can discuss in the esports scene. That is not like who did the best draft, what is the style of play? I mean, I'm pretty sure people on Reddit should know this because they themselves almost exclusively don't discuss the aforementioned things in the game. They discuss everything around the game. The people in the game, rule decisions, how the league's set up, should people be banned, is this streamer too top? Every topic that everyone actually wants to talk about has fuck all to do with the game. In fact, it's only tangentially connected, which is why I've always thought it's pretty funny how they determine that like relevance rule on Reddit, because it's like, on the one hand, you definitely do let stuff on there that's just people who happen to play League of Legends, but the entire content has nothing to do with the game. But then on the other hand, you can put other content up. Like I remember when, I think it was when you joined Yahoo, right? Where they just like didn't allow the post up, even though...
Oh yeah, that I joined Yahoo.
Yeah, which seems pretty relevant since you were obviously going to create League content there, presumably.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've gotten this a lot before where people feel, I think there's a lot of discussion to have around the things that are happening outside of the game, right? And people get frustrated that my content isn't as analytical, but I'm like, look, the entire broadcast of the LCS every weekend is filled with analytical conversation on the analyst desk and the opening show, oftentimes in the interviews themselves, and quite frequently, you know, the other outlets are all doing conversations around the draft and all that stuff. So for me, I've always felt comfortable tackling the conversations around like, how does the team function? What does it mean for a player to get traded? What are the practice environments like that these guys are enjoying, which is a big conversation that's happening right now. So super happy to talk about all that stuff. And I do think it's highly relevant to the issue at hand, is what's going on in the broader esports ecosystem, because you can have a team that drafts great, but if they can't ever get good mechanic practice because solo queue is not where it needs to be and Riot's not supporting that in the North American scene, then that's a important conversation to be addressing, I think.
So I thought a good place for us to start, because it's going to sound abstract, but actually it ties into everything that goes into how stressed players are and how much they complain and how drastic every result seems, has to be the format of moving back to best of ones. Because even if you know in your brain, right, if this was like a best of three, maybe this team's better and they might have come back, it doesn't matter that you know that. The second you watch the game and then you look at the standings and you see this team's 2-4 and they've lost the last three, that still processes in your brain. It's like, oh my God, they've lost the last three. Oh, they're in trouble. Like, where are they going in the league? Not many games left, It does make things just more black and white, It makes things more, each individual result becomes more life and death. And you see, I've noticed in interviews, this has now become a trend again, where players just complain that like, oh, people bashed us for the one thing we did in that game. Or, people are going so much hate when we lose a game. Format surely has to play a role in that, right?
Yeah. Like I think today I was interviewing Bjergsen, and he was saying he was frustrated that this was spawned out of a double lift interview I did that unfortunately the file got corrupted on. But this past weekend, CLG did this interesting CLED composition, and they lost because of it. And immediately, the community, what is happening? Memes about Tony not knowing what a good comp is. And then I interviewed Peter, and he was saying that he feels like really frustrated that teams get so punished for trying innovative things and losing in a single match, and everybody says, oh, these guys don't even know what they're doing. And I pushed that forward, the conversation forward with Bjergsen, and he was agreeing with it. And so, yes, I do think it's interesting, because when we had best of threes, there was this conversation around, best of threes, this format that's going to allow for so much innovation. By the way, I don't know if it did. I mean, you guys tell me if I'm wrong on that. But I feel like it's not like, all of a sudden everyone tries all these crazy zany things. People still want to win, so they play the stuff that they think is going to win. But yeah, it's very funny. I think best of ones and best of threes almost become like a bit of a red herring, where players will love to blame the best of three when they lose. Oh, we could have had them in that other game, and team. Whenever a fan says, oh, my team would be number one right now if only we had best of threes, it's sort of this kind of weird side conversation that occurs, and I think will happen until the end of days, right? Like when we're best of threes, yes, people want best of ones, vice versa.
Has it actually been your experience, though, like from your perspective and from the fans that you meet and when you read Reddit, like the kind of pulse of the community, do you think people actually prefer best of ones? For the North American LCS, that is.
Yeah, I think the Reddit audience is more prone to like best of threes, because the Reddit audience is like the most hardcore. Quite frankly, I think the Reddit audience likes to think of themselves as the most hardcore. I also think that the Reddit audience is more likely to read a headline and not look at the content and then just go into the comments and talk about it, which implies that they're not. But in talking to a lot of general fans, friends of mine that are into League but don't necessarily go to Reddit, you get a sense that a lot of these people felt a lot of fatigue with best of threes. They stopped watching because it just became too much, and they didn't like having to switch between different streams. So I continue, even though we have seen continued viewership dropping, to think that best of ones are the way to go about it, even in a world where the hardcore fans would rather see best of threes, because in their mind they'd rather their team be able to show it's the maximum potential over the course of a 3-game match than otherwise. So I'm okay with the best of one switch. I still think it's good. I think right now we'd be in double trouble with viewership if we were selling best of threes, but I understand why some people are frustrated by it.
Right, Kelsey, when I ask you if you like the best of ones, it has to be purely in the context of like Western audience, for the people watching, etc., because clearly that is something that people have had to ask themselves about at Riot, because viewership's been certainly in an interesting place the last few years. Still very good, but at the same time not necessarily like increasing in the way that esports want to have that big line on a graph going up to sell to the future sponsors, etc. So in the context of like how it actually plays out in the game, tempered with whether you actually think fans want it or not, where would you come down on it?
Yeah, I think I was in support of the move back to best of ones, or at least I talked a lot about the pros, even if I wasn't like definitively one side or the other. So I do think there are positives to moving to best of one. for sure, even outside of the context, but I do think it helps in the fan context as well, because the fans want to see like the one-off match. They want to feel satisfied seeing their favorite team play for 30 minutes. They don't necessarily have a whole hour and a half to invest in a best of series when they could be doing something else, or they could be watching another team they like. And I mean, I don't necessarily know if it has a major impact on viewership or not, but I think for people who just like want to show up and watch a couple of games, best of ones is probably better for them.
Because we've referenced this a few times on the show, so I'll give a very brief summary of what I think of it. Because in terms of viewership, I'm not talking about the pure numbers, but in terms of how I feel as though people enjoy the product more, it does seem as though best of one suits the Western audience better. Like if anything, I think they've got the right divide now, where it's like the LCK people who really still will stay up to like, I don't know what time it is in America, I assume like 4 a.m. or something to watch. If you're really going to do that, you probably do want to watch all the games and go super in depth, But as far as I've noticed, the part that a lot of people don't seem to articulate about why I think best of ones work for the Western audience is because this is actually where, funnily enough, if you're Riot, you should take notes from this, because inadvertently you were right with best of ones for the wrong reason. So what's funny is one of the reasons they like best of one, I know from the past, is because a number of the people who in the early days of the esports side of Riot were big fans of the NFL, which for obvious reasons, I mean, you literally get like concussions all the time, is a best of one sport. You don't play a best of three. I mean, it'd be wild to imagine if you could, but you obviously can't in that sport, right? And so what's funny is, though, actually no one's consuming League and never did in the way that they consumed the NFL. Because in the NFL, you watch the team you're interested in and then a few big nationally televised games where, like the two teams that were in the the conference final last year play each other in the big game that's like one of the stadiums. You have a few big games, and in fact, this is the point I'm going to get to as to why I actually think that people prefer to watch the best of ones. It is actually because, whereas, like I say, in the NFL broadcast, you don't watch all the teams. I actually get the feeling, especially the Reddit crowd, do want to watch all the games because they want to be able to discuss them all. And the big problem with the best of three format is you had to pick and choose. And so I know myself personally, when I think back on all the splits that were best of ones, while I actually don't like it as a format, like as a purist, and if I was talking about the best teams, it is a lot harder to remember some of the ebbs and flows of the teams when they were playing like 18 best of threes or whatever it was, some outrageous number of games that you couldn't watch them all. And then actually sometimes then in a bizarre sense, the few games you do watch end up coloring your perception of a team too much, but you didn't watch another 5 games that might have like evened that out. But in a weird way, it sounds fucked up, because the other 5 games wouldn't be played in best of one. You're wrong still, but you just don't. No one knows that. So in a mad way, I feel like we all have a better sense for where all the narratives are at.
Well, I think one of the things that happened was it might feel nice to watch like a Cloud9 TSM game be a best of 3. I don't know if it feels better to watch a Cloud9 TSM play best of 3 than it feels worse to watch like FlyQuest Phoenix 1 or whatever. Like the games whenever you had to watch like some of the bottom teams play each other and it just didn't feel like it was significant. That felt so bad. So in other words, it felt like you were increasing like the bad moments of and the bad matches and the sense of like, I just don't give a shit about this. Way more than you were increasing the nicety of having like the hype match be a best of 3, if that makes sense. Like you just have worse moments than you have better moments.
I also don't necessarily think the casual audience is always happiest when the best team is winning. And you're going to end up with situations where results are way more variable in best of ones, so you can hype up storylines with upsets and like weird stuff happening once because say like G2 wasn't sure where they wanted to pick the Aatrox when it fell in their lap or whatever. So you end up in a situation where oh my gosh, Giants beat G2, which is way more likely to happen in a best of 1 scenario than in a best of 3 scenario.
Which you see at Worlds, right? Worlds, everyone loves group stage, especially the first week of group stage, because, wow, the wild card is like taking down these top-seeded teams. Then the hilarious thing is how much the tone changes when you get to quarterfinals. Quarterfinals frequently, historically, are just these like one-sided stomps. and you're kind of like, all right, I got to get through quarterfinals to let the scraps that have somehow bungled their way through group stage get filtered out before we get to semifinals and watch Korean teams play Korean teams. So it is kind of interesting to see that play out, where you literally see the differences in best of ones and best of threes take place in group stage and in quarterfinals at Worlds.
Like, I feel as though, unfortunately, this is where, like, it's not even the fault of best of one, like, explicitly. You can definitely have splits. You can remember some of the ones in the past, like, obviously the one where Fnatic went 18-0 in Europe. You can have very dominant teams. You can have very, very poor teams, as other teams in other regions have shown this split. But the interesting thing is, I feel like, unfortunately, best of one's colliding with all the meta changes and the chaos that still exists of how teams are trying to play and then what the opponent's trying to do. And the fact that so many teams still haven't got like a direct read on what they even want to do necessarily yet has unfortunately led to what I do think is the nightmare scenario in best of ones, which is what the NALCS is right now, where 2 games separate second to last place and absolute top of the league. So it means that unless we get some teams that really figure things out and some teams that really don't, we're going to end up with like a ridiculous playoff race where, you know, like it really could be one game and it could be like one specific cheese that costs you your whole playoff spot or puts you into the semifinals directly. Like this could be one of those crazy ones.
It's interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot. So frequently years ago, EU LCS, and this is when I think I started to become less invested in EU LCS. EU LCS would have a lot of these seasons where they would just, everyone would be so close. And it's interesting because the way the league and sort of the broadcast tries to tell that story is like, wow, it's so hype right now. Everyone's so close. We've got all these great teams, but it's really hard to structure any kind of narrative around the idea that like everyone is really good. And like you know, thinking about it to make a very strange transition, you kind of need, when you're telling like an interesting story, like a very strong entity, right? Like if it's a villain, if it is a just like this god hero that can go around and kick everyone's ass, like you need somebody who looks like the person where when they show up, interesting things happen, and battles go one way or whatever. And I think it's really hard right now for me to cover the NALCS in an interesting way. Like Bjergsen was giving me shit in my interview that went out today, where I asked him about paying and practice for NALCS players, which is a big conversation right now. It's like, oh, you're just looking for a headline. Everyone keeps using those headlines. I'm like, I don't know what else to talk about, dude. Like, are you is TSM good right now? Some people say you're good, others say you aren't, and you look about as good as everyone else right now. So like, it becomes this weird challenge. And I think you're right that best of ones, someone contribute to it, right? Is that as many times as it's super fun to see the team go undefeated for like half the split before they finally lose, it's really rough whenever you just see everybody taking games off each other and there's no clear team that's ahead of the game.
That's certainly fucking rich coming from Bjergsen, one of the most on-message pros I've ever seen in interviews. I mean, that guy just, like, it's almost like he knows the question before it even comes. His brain's just like, no, I think that, we trust Andy and the sister. It's like, come on, mate, you lost the game.
He's been saying some more bold stuff. Okay. I really appreciated at the end of last year whenever he called out All-Stars and said that he felt like All-Stars wasn't good for the players or fans and stuff. He's been getting more out there. But yeah, he does, unlike other pro players who we all know and love, he doesn't put himself out there as much with the bold statements.
Okay, so since you've touched on it already, let's talk about that actually, because obviously the timing of this was pretty good, because people are wondering with all the upheaval with the meta and the fact that all these teams are so close, so that actually engages more of the teams, because it means you still feel like you can play for the playoffs or a chance to go deep, no matter which team you are. You're not really stuck in like, right, well, my team's doing badly, like what we're going to do next split. No one's got that mentality yet. That's why I feel like this topic's come up of you, and also combined with MSI and Rift Rivals, the topic of should LCS pros basically have a pro level pickup ring of some type. Now, if you know CSGO, obviously we have analogs to this for many years. I mean, on the most basic level, you have Face It, which in Europe famously is where you join, and that one, what they did is they limited like the number of pros that were allowed to be in it. And in fact, even if you were a top pro, if you weren't active, they would kick you out of it and make sure that, you know, it's active people in there. So for example, if you were a top pro, but you really do just play the pro tournaments and you never come home and play on it, they'll kick you out for a guy who's not in a top team, but he is as good as the top players, because they wanted to keep a healthy, active environment, but with a limited number of players, so you're not getting just some idiot in the game who's like, oh my God, I'm with pros, let me troll the game or fuck it up. You know, it was basically so that people can really practice. Now, what's funny about that, and obviously the equivalent in NA was ESEA Rank S was the top one that ESEA had over on the North American continent. Now, funnily enough, this has a lot of connection actually to League of Legends, because first of all, if you think back, I'll give you a really, really old school pull here, Travis. Do you remember way back, I think it was like in season 2, because I think it was when Froggen was playing for CLG EU, and there was a scenario where, as is still common today, if a pro player flames someone in a game, a Reddit thread appears, and what we call a witch hunt is started. Yeah. Now, in this particular scenario, what had happened was, it was also the classic thing where the whole like flame back and forwards isn't caught. It's just the pro player saying the bad part. Right. And then, you know, first of all, he is flaming. And then secondly, but without context, it's going to look even worse. And so famously, Froggen was sort of like tearing up some guy who I think trolled as like the jungler in his game or something. But what's funny is people only remember it because they think, oh, like, wow, Froggen's so toxic, like, what an asshole, you know. And in fact, the reason I remember it is because infamously, he didn't delete his Reddit comment, and it actually did get to like -2,000 or some like outrageous number, because all the fans just went straight in on
the
it.
brigade, yeah.
But what's mad is people don't remember his actual sentiment was a really apt and an important sentiment, which is that he said, I'm a pro player. When I play those solo queue games, I'm actually, like, I mean, at the time, he wasn't streaming as heavily, you know, it wasn't as big a part. He was basically making the point that when he played those solo queue games, that was like additional practice to individually hone himself outside of his scrims, and he treats that like real practice. So when he goes in a game and, for example, you know, the guy who's supposed to be the jungler picks a mid champion and then starts coming in his lane, that's why he basically was going off, because he was saying like, there's no way for me to properly practice. Now that's literally 6 years ago, and we've now resurrected this conversation again. So Travis, the first thing to say here is, as I've alluded to with how old the conversation is, what exists in other games. I mean, actually in Dota, that's a scene that famously has what you call in-house leagues, where people would, again, play with little circles of friends, to where a number of players were discovered, like Sumail, who's on Evil Geniuses. Now, one of the reasons that people will be aware of as to why, this is an old discussion, but nothing's really been done about it and not much stink's been kicked up, is because in the past, to my knowledge, and players I've talked to, Riot has in some way inhibited this, or just said they don't want it, or the implication was like, you know, they want the pros to be playing solo queue amongst the general populace, right? For the whole, like, you know, you can play with a pro if you're good ugh path to pro type thinking, right?
When our mutual friend Hunter was at Riot, there was this discussion about this a couple of years ago, and I know that he talked internally with the teams about letting them scrim and practice on the tournament realm. He went on Hotline League recently and was talking about that. The pushback at the time, and Mark did a whole rant about this, and certain players have argued if this is the case or not, was that you can't stream those tournament realm games. And that was the big thing, is that they didn't want, and I assume that's because they are very defensive about the idea, similar to what Blizzard is with Overwatch League. Like, they do not ever want you to see a pro player in some sort of competitive environment unless it is on their broadcast, right, which is LCS. And so I think the concern at the time, among maybe reasons around if it was a good idea to scrim the tournament realm from a security perspective, I don't know. But I think part of the concern, and this is somewhat me speculating based off of their philosophy on this stuff, is that they didn't, how long before you start paying attention to these streamed scrims, and is there a way to start leveling up? And then all of a sudden you've got this like extra league that is happening where like people start to, it can get out of hand, and I think they wanted to shut that down from the very beginning. In talking to Peter recently about this, his argument is that you should be able to stream the tournament realm games because it would incentivize players to participate in it, not just the people streaming, but the pro players that like playing in front of an audience. For them, it would incentivize them to to play on that in that environment and to get attention and get shown.
By the way, it very likely would, because that is exactly what happened with a lot of the streamers in CSGO, are the NA streamers, and they would stream the games that they played in this ESEA Rank S. And the whole reason why it was actually popular is because, first of all, you got to see like a bunch of pros playing in a semi-competitive environment, like, you know, not 100%, but also not totally trolling like you would if you were playing bad people. And also, most crucially, whichever streamer you were choosing to watch, you still also got to hear the comms, because in CS we have voice comms of, you know, the other players, and so you actually, in a mad way, get to sort of double up on like the experience. You get like, for example,
there's like an entertainment option.
Yeah, if you don't follow Mo but you follow Tarek, you know, if he plays in a game with Mo, you hear Tarek's Mo's comms as well, and so you actually get like extra entertainment in a weird way if you want to follow that. So I can certainly see the argument. Like, it certainly. I think
my problem in my pushback to Peter at that time was like, that should not have to. The audience and the community, I think, is frustrated because they feel like pro players have an opportunity to use this tournament environment. Like Riot is giving them access to like a low ping server to practice on, and to say, well, we don't want to do it because we can't stream. It's like, well, in a world where you actually truly just wanted to get better at the game and to improve yourself, sure, it sucks you can't stream it, and that would be an added bonus. But it shouldn't take you needing to play in front of an audience for you to try to practice and get a good environment. Now, Pobelter went on a rant that he kind of got flamed for by the community. I kind of agree with and see is like, there are dramatically frustrating logistical difficulties in managing that tournament realm environment, just because of the fact that like you might end up with 4 mid laners and only 1 ADC. Because of the way that the game is structured from a role perspective, it is hard and taxing and maybe not worth it to spend so much time trying to get these games going.
It's not the case in something like CSGO. In CSGO, you know, you can put 5 players in and you just figure it out.
Yeah.
It's interesting that this was like a big thing, though, because for a certain amount of time, we had EU players just streaming practice, like custom game practice. For just recently, within the past year and a half. So just like this would be a consistent thing among some of the players, like Maxlore, Perks, like a bunch of the well-known players would actually do this together, and they would stream them all playing, and it would be like whoever shows up gets up on a team, and most of the time they could consistently get 10 like players that fit their role, just in general, because they would be specifically inviting, like you want to play the in-house, right? And it didn't seem like it was that big of a stressful situation for them to actually set it up, because it was like a casual, everyone finishes scrim at the same time. Hey, you want to play in-houses?
Sure.
I think in general, though, the way the meta is right now, and this is a point that I heard brought up, it's a little bit more difficult to agree to do in-houses with LCS players, because part of what's going on in this meta is not knowing what the other team is playing, not knowing what the other player is practicing, not knowing, like, because, for example, bot laners are all playing new champions, and someone might play that champion completely differently from you just because they're learning it at a different rate or in a different environment. So it's to them, like, it's almost better, even if NA solo queue is a stressful, crappy environment, to like run into someone who's playing Rumble bot or some shit like this and decide, oh, that's actually cool, I might want to play that in scrims, you know, even if this guy is trolling, right? Like, they might actually get more out of like a troll environment at that point. And I think that's also a point that has been brought up specifically in this scenario as well. But the whole headache of like stressfully negotiating like these type of in-houses is something I never really bought, because a lot of players will just do it casually anyway, you know? Yeah. So
that might be the case. He was explicitly saying like they tried this with a spreadsheet and it was just a pain in the ass and all this stuff. So maybe it's just easier in Europe or something. I don't know. But well, that was another to your point though about sort of hiding practice or playing against unique champions or whatever. That was Pobelter's other point, in that playing against, like, laning against Soren, he's literally helping Soren get practice against him by helping to teach him how Pobelter plays a certain champion. So if he's going to play him in like 2 weeks, he's going to learn how aggressive he is, like the ebb and flow, like when he's stepping, like that type of stuff.
That's also, if you think about it, nuance which doesn't carry over. Because the problem is, if people keep using the CSGO example, because clearly it does exist, it's one of the, and by the way, one of the reasons why we have it in CSGO is not because it's like the most effective practice method. It's that our matchmaking system isn't like the League of Legends one. It's much, much worse if you're a pro. It's fine if you're just a normal person, but the problem is for pros, we basically like there's global elite is not the equivalent of being challenger in League of Legends. Like it's not the same limited amount of people. Because you play in a team setting, you can actually boost each other in a mad way that you can't in League of Legends. Like the whole setup is so different that they actually, it almost necessitated having somewhere that pros went and played, because otherwise they just wouldn't play. They wouldn't instead play matchmaking like League of Legends pros play solo queue. They just wouldn't play. They just play more scrims, or they'd do a private custom game 10-man anyway. And hence a service just came along and said, hey, why don't we just make money off this concept and do it anyway? So I definitely think you brought up a lot of points there. So for example, the mid laner matchup, well, that's not really the same in a CS game. Like even if I go play the same in theory CT spot, like I'm not playing against the same type of team. There's not a laning phase, you know, every round we're just playing anyway. You probably know roughly my tendency, you know, it's such a different game in that sense. None of that crosses over. But what I'll say is this, one area that I kind of come down on both people's side on is, yeah, I totally understand fans who are like, but if this is really a chance to play low ping with other elite pros and get better, because, you know, often, I mean, to be fair to the fans, NA pros set themselves up in this regard by saying so often, oh, we can't play seriously in solo queue because people are just trolling and stuff. Like that doesn't work if you then say, oh, but I won't play in the other thing because even though people wouldn't be trolling, I need to stream. But when I come down on the pros side of things, to be fair, I can't blame them that the industry's stunted in that sense, because as much as League of Legends salaries are pretty inflated, they still aren't so high that you just wouldn't stream. Like you'd still rather stream as well. And in fact, sadly, a sort of fucked up side tangent is that if you are a pro player who is decent in LCS and isn't an asshole as a person, so, you know, no one has any reason to want you off the team, and you meet all your streaming hours and God forbid, actually have like a personality and people like you, you can stay on that team for a lot longer than if you just excel in the game League of Legends. I don't have to mention many names. You can think of some good players, but not great players, and you can think of some bad players who, I used to joke, you know, in a competitive sense, stole checks for many years. One of them used to have a weird laugh and like, I'm a cutie pie. You know, there's a reason why these guys can stick around, because they actually, there is a lot to be gained, unfortunately, in League that wouldn't work in a sporting sense, you know. Like in a sports sense, you get paid so much, yeah, the bottom line is win the game, you know, do what you can in practice to win the match. I can't really blame pros entirely on that one, because yes, on the abstract point of could you try to get better, maybe. Yeah, maybe. Even then, we can't really know if it would help, because as you're mentioning, there's a lot of factors that would make it nothing like the match you're going to play in LCS. But then on the other side of the equation, how can you tell a guy who can literally make some money now? Kelsey's gone. She's died.
Kelsey's gone.
Well, whatever. I'll finish this point and then... Wait, I'll just resize you while I'm talking. And then... What was I saying there? Oh, yeah. So obviously, in the short term, I totally understand why someone would want to make money. And in this setting, if you're not allowed to do it, there you go, she's back. I also get why they'd turn down the opportunity. So I think, unfortunately, it's one of those scenarios where, you know, they're sort of painted into a corner. I don't think there's a right choice there.
The problem is, I think they are getting the area I disagree with you on is that I think they are starting to get to that point in their salary where it's like, all right, you're getting paid a lot of money to be good at this game. Like we can get past the streaming point, right? Like you should be able to turn down the modicum of money that you can get streaming just to be good.
Sure, but here's the thing though, Travis. Like when you say that, like that's not his owner saying that though. Like Jack Etienne doesn't want you telling his players, like, don't stream, by the way, guys. Just go for number one. Don't stream. Like,
yeah.
He definitely want those guys hitting that number in the contract.
A good resource for him, I'm sure, and presenting to sponsors. The stream hours are good.
Can I ask, is this even an argument, like the streaming argument? Is this even something that the players are still using now? Because I'm
Peter
a bit
is using it.
surprised. Now?
Peter is using it, but a lot, yeah, now. Like, to me, but he's less about, like, I want to make money, and he's more about, this is a cool way to showcase the skills and incentivize people to be part of it, right? Is that, like, someone like Apollo might be more interested in being in a in-house league in a world where he's getting he can play lane against Peter and get some notoriety because maybe he beats them at some point in time and that clip ends up on Reddit, than he would be if this is just like a quiet game happening behind the scenes.
That is, by the way, the element that I referred to before with the rank S and the streamers in CSGO. That is actually what was part of the... In fact, here's what's funny, Travis, is that people actually ended up getting mad at the CSGO pros for the same reason, which is that they did stream all the games, and because they streamed the games, it did make them sometimes overly go on the entertainment side and fuck around in the games, instead of playing the game as if it was a proper competitive match. So they ended up with the opposite outcome. Yeah, because they were just trying to entertain the viewers. So actually what's funny is the fans got mad at them for that. Now, to be fair, I do think, though, that the timing of this is a little bit suspect to me, because the reason why I feel like fans and other commentators, Mark, go so ham right now is because in League of Legends, more so than any game I've ever followed, because the games are regionalized, and then when you come to the international tournament, people do make it like, right, well, I'm from NA, so I'm supporting all the NA teams, and if NA sucks, then somehow people can talk shit to me directly as opposed to just on the team. People then come back to the thing of anytime NA fails, it's like, right, are they lazy? Are the pros doing enough?
I mean, I think
do what Koreans do.
Rift Rivals. Like that,
yeah, that's what I mean.
The fact that and it's not, I don't even mean like the results of Rift Rivals. I mean, it was so, it felt like all the EU LCS players that came over had like this campaign, like these talking points on how they were going to shit talk NA when they came over here. Because universally across all the teams, all the players said, it's so nice over here. Like, players mustn't, like, you must get lazy because there's such good food and such good weather. And they said the solo queue is so bad. And they just harped on the solo queue so much that it became this thing where like players would, like the EU players would say the solo queue is so bad, that's why they are bad. And then I would go to the NALCS players and say, are you bad because of the solo queue? And it just sort of snowballed this argument out of control. That's why I think it's so funny, by the way, because like I was joking about this in one of my interviews. It would be very funny if all this conversation, it's not like the NALCS players are suddenly themselves coming out and being like, by the way, we've been sucking because of solo queue. Like, this conversation all started because of the EU LCS pros. I think it'd be very hilarious and ironic if there does come something out of this. NA, whatever, gets a better practice environment, can become better players. And it all started because EU players came here and started complaining about or talked about how shit the environment was, right?
Let's be clear, though. It's not just Rift Rivals and the players, EU players spontaneously saying NA solo queue sucks. Legit, every time there is an international event hosted in North America, the foreign players complain about NA solo queue. But it's not like they all coordinated and said, oh, this Rift Rivals, let's just like completely wig the NA players out, psych them out mentally, and be like, oh, let's just do that. Let's just complain about
being a little bit facetious.
Yeah, I know, but it's
but the bullet points, it felt like all the talking points were so. I know that they all complained about solo queue, but they all also said the same thing about the environment being too good. It was just hilarious how on point, like universal, all these guys were. And I get that they always complain about the solo queue situation, but this time in particular, they seem to. They frequently would say solo queue is bad. This is the first time where they've all said, that is why NA players are bad, is because the solo queue is bad.
Kelsey.
I think that's something that NA players themselves have been saying for ages too, though. Like, I think the point I want to make isn't necessarily that they didn't have a campaign, just that this has been a constant sentiment. It's just like this has come out when EU pros talk about it, when Korean pros who come to NA talk about it. Yep. They talk about how crap the solo queue is. Like, they talk about how, like, I've read a lot of interviews with Korean pros who play in NA, and they'll say that playing on the solo queue makes them worse players. Like,
but how often do they say that might be why America sucks?
Well, no, they specifically say playing in the solo queue environment makes them worse players.
Yeah.
Straight up. So they'll say that. So it's not like a new idea, and it's not, and maybe they all like this, it all became just like a meme, this Rift Rivals, because there was a constant feedback loop, and you and other content creators were fanning the flames a bit by going back and forth. I'm not saying that you caused it,
Fanning
Travis
the flames,
Gafford.
Kelsey?
I'm saying you egged each of them on to like kind
Egged
of
them
this
on?
is a talking point. We're gonna bring it up. That's what content creators do.
Didn't have a gun against anyone's head, Kelsey. They had their own free will to answer the question.
It was a conversation
He
topic.
hates
that I
my
brought
words. He hates my words. As a content creator, you are encouraging the exchange of information. That is fanning of flames.
I don't know if you're sitting up more or if your webcam's flipping, but it's very funny. You're slowly disappearing from the shot.
She was trying to literally lock down on you, Travis. She was literally getting on a high horse, just going.
You
off
guys
as she
fan the flames.
I've been I was a content creator very recently. I know that when you're asking questions that have been brought up by pros in other interviews, you're trying to create like a circulation of information.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I used to just ask everyone about double lift in every single interview.
Do you know what a circulation of information is? Like circulating air above a fire, Travis Gafford, fanning the flames. Let's go.
We don't need this anymore.
The metaphors are getting too interconnected and deep here, Kelsey.
But the point is that I think it's just like it's natural for this type of thing to be constantly brought up. Like 2013 October, Hotshot GG gets on Twitter and is like, NA solo queue is bad. This is why NA will always be the worst region. Here, I'll find the tweet. NA
Kelsey,
will always be the worst region. Solo queue shapes players, and when NA players are trolling, nobody takes it serious.
You should retweet that.
Results. What?
You should retweet that right now. Bring it back.
Bring it back. Bring it
Kelsey,
back. Retweet it.
We have established that it is an old talking point. So what does this lead to?
It is an old talking point. Like, what it leads to is the fact that, it's going to continue to be a talking point. It's going to continue to be brought up until there is some kind of resolution. And people are, like, in general, using NA solo queue as an excuse to say that like they can't perform well. So at that point, you do have a jump off point. You either say, okay, we'll deal with it, we'll do the in-houses, or this will continue to be a joke, this will continue to be a meme until we find something else to complain about. It's like,
how about this, Kelsey?
It hasn't changed. That's basically it. It literally Kelsey, hasn't changed.
The same talking points are going to be recycled in the NLCS for many years to come.
Yeah.
This is something we're aware of and will continue. But
I think it's forcing like something might come out of this, though. I actually believe
you actually think something will change this time because it has been a talking point forever, as we pointed out, and nothing has changed.
What about this? Do you think it actually having in-houses or this sort of tournament realm pickup games, do you think, Kelsey, it would actually help raise the level of NA pros in any context? You know, maybe in this particular meta, it might be an extreme set of circumstances. So let's imagine in a normal meta where, you know, everyone plays their role and you can actually get an AD carry and a support to play in a game. And you can get a top, you know, you can get all that. Do you think it actually helps enough that it's more than just a talking point?
Let's put it this way. Does Pobelter think that he is a much better laner than Bjergsen and vice versa? And I guess you don't even have to go that far. Does Pobelter think Bjergsen is a much better laner than the average solo queue mid laner? Because if he says yes, then playing against Bjergsen more frequently than he would play against an average solo queue mid laner will make Pobelter a better laning mid laner in general. That's the way it is. Like, so there has to be a come down point where does it matter more in the long run that I'm a better player or that we beat TSM in 2 weeks? And I'm not saying that there is like a hard and fast answer and that if he doesn't say, oh, it matters more that I'm a better player, that he's a horrible person and he's not prioritizing the right things. But that's like essentially when he brings that point up, it's kind of what it comes out as, unless
the logical outcome of it,
unless he's saying that playing against better players isn't going to improve me, which that's a whole separate conversation, and I think most people would disagree with that statement.
Okay. What about this, Travis? So another topic, if you want to talk about like NA improving or the potential to improve, which is another clear one, which has analogs in other esports, but again is applied differently in League of Legends, is the topic of playing against the other regions more often. So this either comes up in two ways. One, people want more international tournaments, except they don't, because they then always complain about Rift Rivals and All-Stars. So they don't at the same time. People are very unsure about exactly what they want. They know when they want change, but they don't always know what they want. And then the other way it expresses itself is the more logical one, but difficult to execute, which is have more Korean boot camps or opportunities to go to Korea, play the Koreans in their scrim environment. And as a result, I mean, here's the thing, again, that doesn't perfectly work because you're not Koreans and you're not necessarily got the
people are more jaded about the Korean.
They're not as up on those anymore?
Yeah, I think they are. I've talked to several players who come back from Korean boot camps and they feel like they were a waste. I think it depends on what you want out of it. I don't know if players going to, like, this year it won't matter, by the way, because everyone gets to go to Korea for Worlds. Hopefully Riot decides to tell us about that soon. But all the players get to go to Korea for Worlds, and they'll just boot camp there. But generally speaking, I think when you have to go to Europe for Worlds, a lot of the players are starting to feel like they go to Korea, they have a hard time getting the scrims that they want, or they get scrims canceled on them. Like they feel all jet lagged, they just don't have that good of an experience, and they're like, they feel like it's really not great practice to go all the way to Korea for this stuff. I do think that there are a lot of players who still believe in the idea that you can go over there as an individual during off season for like a month and play in that environment and practice. And by the way, I think half the reason why that stuff works is because it's more of like a, I'm going to go train in the wilderness type of thing. Like
it's like a practice with purpose thing. Yeah.
I'm going on this like sabbatical to like learn how to be better. Yeah. I think that's part of it. It's like a mentality thing. But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's all right. You give a lot there. Like, what do you think, Kelsey? Are either of these two aspects that are going to affect things?
I do think that you have players, most of the players I've talked to about going to Korea individually have positive things to say about it. They say that like either being in a completely different environment helps them focus, or the internet in Korea is legitimately good, by the way. Like you're having less issues with connectivity and bad ping and stuff just in general. Like it's just easier to focus on playing your matchups and playing the champions and climbing the ladder. And you don't have, also I think a big part of it is it's like if you're going to Korea to boot camp independently, you're literally working on yourself and you don't necessarily have the stress of the team environment or anything like this.
But as far as the international tournaments go, I'm mixed on that as well. I think that the European teams probably didn't gain much from coming to North America, partially just because they had to come to North America in the middle of their split. That sucks. Conversely, I think North America probably benefited a lot from Europe coming over here. It's like a meme now that I bring up Heimerdinger so much, but NA LCS was so obstinate about playing that champion, and it was hilarious then that like people come over here, wreck people with Heimerdinger, and now you see it popping up way more, and ADCs who are like convinced that it's not a meme pick. So it's I don't know. I'm like really mixed on the international tournament and international play experience, because I think in some ways it can be really good, and in some ways it can not be very helpful.
It's okay. Yeah, go on.
You also had the reverse situation last year where you talked about learning a lot from NA coming
Kelsey,
to Rift Rivals.
Do you think that it was helpful for Europe to have that experience over here this year?
Oh, you mean the EU teams going to NA specifically?
Yeah.
This time around, I feel like they probably didn't necessarily get a lot out of it. If anything, maybe Splice got something out of it, because Splice got the huge boost of, we just beat the #1 NA team as one of the crappiest teams in EU LCS, and then they came back and they were just doing better and looking better, And also Splice showed up playing like a bunch of like spring Splice shit. They looked completely out of it, and then suddenly, they start to pick up some momentum. They're looking better overall. They found some stuff that works for them there, I think.
What if we looked at Rift Rivals as way for the West to try to improve themselves before. By the way, I think Rift Rivals should just be moved to the off season, and that they should gut All Stars and just make Rift Rivals that. But in a world where Rift Rivals continues to be this mid-season event, it'd be really interesting if it was a 4-day event. 2 days are out of the EU LCS studio, 2 days are out of the NA LCS studio, and we send a couple NA teams to Europe and a couple EU teams to NA. It'd be kind of interesting to see what happens there, because then both sides get some benefit and both sides get some downsides.
I actually think, to be fair, I think Kelsey's frozen again, so I'm expecting her to drop.
Sure.
Because she also hasn't responded when I said that, right? So anyway, I'll continue the point until she comes back. Right.
Yeah.
One thing I think is actually an issue with that tournament is just that I understand the Riot mentality, which is like, right, well, we've got Worlds, and that has a defined concept of what it is. And then you didn't miss much, Kelsey. I'm making the point now.
Yeah.
And then MSI is obviously... MSI is actually quite clever. If you don't want there to be 2 Worlds in a year, but you want to make it still distinct and still a good competition, because then it's like, right, it's just only the best. And so actually, probably to me, the coolest part of MSI isn't even the tournament. It's that it gives something for teams to shoot for in the middle of the split, the middle of the season, rather, when the split ends. It's not just like split one's just about getting some circuit points. I actually think that's the better aspect. It's like each split is building into a competition, so it gives a natural arc for everyone to sort of focus towards. The problem I see with Rift Rivals is not just the fact it takes place during the split, which is obviously going to be an issue for whoever gets the tournament in their region, etc. But I think more importantly, that like the format of it is so wacky that on the one hand, it's like set up as though it's supposed to be purely an exhibition tournament. But I feel like everyone wants it to be like a real tournament. They want to believe that the results mean something, but no one seems like they really do. Like even when the team that wins talks shit, they don't really talk shit in the same way you would if, like if you'd made top 8 at Worlds and the other guy bombed out. Like there's kind of a lot more distinct and a lot more serious.
Yeah, they say this like they're like, this was a waste of our time. It's kind of funny.
So to me, the problem there is I don't know how you construct a third international tournament, but keep it distinct and yet also make it, if people want this, a real tournament.
I do think that there's room for it to just be kind of fun, like the way it is. Like I actually really like the LPL, LMS, LCK format, and I'm glad that they took that the NAEU one kind of took it for the playoffs, where you're putting the team in to play against like the other side. Stagger. It's like a distinct kind of concept for an event. No, it feels much different, right? And it makes it much more like the EU teams are literally collaborating to beat the NA teams, and it's much more EU versus NA. So I like that feel a lot, even though the format is wonky. One issue I have with the format and the timing is just what Travis said, like, what if we take 2 teams from NA and we send them to EU, and 2 teams from EU and send them to NA, and we made it a 4-day event? Well, travel restrictions, players actually, it has to take place in one weekend, right? Because it's the middle of the split, and we aren't going to delay LCS even more for another weekend or another extra time of Rift Rivals. Some teams didn't get back like the next day. They had sponsorship events or whatever, and so they didn't necessarily have time to prepare for the next set of EU. So it just, because you can't really change the format too much, and I think that's the biggest problem with the Rift Rivals, is just like how restricted it is in terms of the time window from being any type of event or changing it too much.
Yeah, that's why you put it in the off season. I don't think All Stars is a great event. I think it continues to get worse every year. So just stick it in the off season. And by the way, then that gives us something to like, that's the consolation prize for Worlds, right? Is like, all right, so you didn't make it out of groups. Don't worry, you've got Rift Rivals on the horizon. You can hopefully beat your main rival and things will be good. I don't know what it means for the rest of the region.
I don't mind All Stars as just because I think for a lot of players who go to All Stars, if it doesn't have the All Stars tinge to it, it almost would feel like a punishment, you know? But because it's literally, oh, the fans voted for me, I'm the most popular player in my role in this region, and I'm going to go and we're going to have a good time and we're going to play some games. We're probably not going to scrim like
they don't have a good time though.
Or do a bunch of stuff because it's players do. So it depends.
Say that last part again. What, like after the part about it not being fun, what did you say?
Which one? No, they're going there to have fun.
I was saying that I don't think it is fun. I was saying I don't think the guys are having fun. And in interviewing them at last year's Worlds, they felt like the events just felt very bland. And the fact that it happens in the NA LCS studio, they're coming there right after going to World Championships. Like Riot can't decide if it's fun or not. And I don't think Riot has been able to find a central theme for that event. I think that when you have NA versus EU, there's like a good themes there. I think from my understanding, the LPL LCK thing, they take it even more seriously. Like you actually have a great feeling there. Like the NA guys just get frustrated because they want to. Like I think all the guys they want to go out and do something else. They just don't want to deal with it.
I just think the way that Riot marketed Last All-Stars was really wrong. Like it's funny because they said, "Oh, we want this to be a serious event, so we're getting rid of the fun modes, and it's just going to be really serious and competitive." Yeah. And the problem is that there was higher viewership on the actual competitive games of just like regular Summoners Rift, LMS versus LPL or whatever it was, and so they weren't really getting rid of making it more serious. They were making it better for viewers, which doesn't necessarily mean it's more serious. It just means that, okay, this is what the viewers, because they also have the one-on-ones. One-on-ones were really hype. People liked watching those. But that doesn't make the event more serious. It just makes it like more clean, right? It makes it less bullshit, less stuff that people don't really understand, right? And it's just like, it's still supposed to think they marketed it completely wrong because the entire community and all the players were like really confused by the marketing. So I don't know. I think that All Stars is fine and it has a distinct place. And I don't necessarily want to add like another big tournament after Worlds and have the same kind of teams that were at Worlds at that tournament because I feel like that should be their time off, you know?
The thing is, I actually think that All Stars is by far the worst tournament to feature top pros in the entire League of Legends calendar. Because first of all, like it doesn't really work because like as a team game, it's actually going back to what Travis said earlier about the pickup games. Since people have like distinct roles and they don't even play identically those roles in their teams, I don't think it actually just produces good League of Legends. Like I think when you watch these, even though they are actually all-star teams, you know, they're some of the best players from NA, Europe, I think they all play worse than even a like mid-table team from their region would if they went in their place. Like I think the actual League of Legends is worse, which unfortunately doesn't work because if you watch something like the NBA All-Star game, right, here's the thing. Yes, at certain times in the game, they do stuff just for entertainment, you know, like throw an extra pass so someone can do a fucking alley-oop slam or something. But that's because the format of a basketball game is many, many different actions that aren't all building into each other. They're all distinct. So as a result, you can fuck around for 5 minutes and then you can try for 5 minutes at the end of the game. You know, you can make it serious when you want to. In a game of League of Legends, first of all, there's not going to be as much crazy stuff for the first 15 minutes anyway. So it can't be like an all-star game in that sense, showing off like, you know, all your mad individual skills. And then it's also impossible to mess around for 5 minutes and then play seriously at one point. You know, the game has snowballed out of control at that point. So to me, the game itself, this is just unfortunately the nature of League of Legends as a competitive game, just doesn't really suit that sort of format as well. And then you add in the fact that some of these players play in an entire system that's totally different, you know. It's actually, funnily enough, one of the reasons why, if you notice, the NFL's, their all-star aspect has never been as big a deal. In fact, they even removed it at one point in time because it just, you know, that's a game where people run an entire offense that the other guy would have no clue about because he's never played under that quarterback. So it doesn't really make sense to think this is going to be like showing off your skills. You're not. You're going to be doing the opposite. You're going to be all severely limited, just doing what you can and hoping people enjoy it at home.
Yeah. I don't know. I always thought the first All-Star they ever did, the first All-Star event, felt really good.
I think there's a caveat to that though, Travis, which is that if you remember, like, because that was 2013, the game was so much simpler back then. I actually feel like the format did work back then. Like back then, if you really did just put all the best players in, they could sort of cobble together enough of a game. And plus it was a very open meta, if you remember. You could play a lot of playmaking champions, really dominant carries. So I think that, if anything, that actually sort of like helped you be in this sort of scenario. The problem is, when you get into like the latter years where the game itself is very tactical, I feel like a lot of that can't translate, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't. That's just like the thing is maybe it's too little of the casual audience. Whereas I don't think you necessarily have to go super ham on the tactical stuff. I think a lot of the casual audience will just be entertained by like the all-star players playing what they think is a decent team comp in the meta, and just like kind of maybe they don't have the best synergy, but they're all trying to make like cool out plays, and maybe that causes them to lose. Who knows? Because the other team has better team play. But I still think that that's the kind of thing that people would want to see, just like after Worlds is over, you know, as just a cool down, much more casual.
I could definitely buy that you're right, that actually fans won't care. But to tie into what you and Travis were just discussing a minute ago, I think the issue here is I feel like for the players themselves, they don't really, that's not really appealing to them. Like, just go there and have fun. Not least because actually, if you want to tie it back in, the fact that so many of them do stream means they already get to show off like fun stuff for their fans and engage with them. The thing about NBA players is you play in the match.
But I think
you know, the All-Star game is a chance for you to just play for fun and pop off. You don't do that there's no stream for NBA players, you know.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I do think that there's certainly a pride element to think that like my fans and my viewers think that I'm the favorite player and I'm representing this. I still think there's like some pride involved. So it's not just like the same as streaming or showing off like at home. I think there is something to it that makes a lot of sense for them, but I don't know. It's not obviously not consistent among every single player.
Well, I'll give you the reason though, Kelsey, as to why when you say that, I don't buy it entirely, because here's the problem. It's a smaller scale version of why Rift Rivals still isn't established as a legit tournament, is that if the top Korean team in the world goes to Rift Rivals and loses, that alone is not enough for people to say, wow, like the shift of power's changed in the game. Korea's not going to... What they'll say is, who gives a fuck about Rift Rivals? Not a real tournament. Same thing in All-Stars. If the Korean team loses, we don't think, holy shit, maybe Europeans are as good. People just go, it's just an All-Star game. So unfortunately, I feel like I can kind of see where you're going with that, but I don't know if it entirely lands.
No, I mean, I don't necessarily think it's... I don't necessarily think it's not the same as being like the best player, but I think in like certain players who actually work on cultivating their brand and building a fan base, and just like they have this opportunity to congregate among a bunch of other players like that, and just kind of like show what they can do and like make their fans proud of being in that player. Like maybe they do more broadcast interviews in that sense, like maybe they do more stuff like that. I think it's much more about, for me, All-Stars is much more about an opportunity for players to like connect with the fan bases that they've cultivated, rather than an opportunity for players to be like the sickest on the Rift, you know? I don't know.
Okay, so Travis, something you alluded to at the beginning, which was obviously in the headline of your Bjergsen interview, was him speaking to backlash from fans when you try to do something innovative in this new meta. And obviously you referenced also the CLG example where they tried a new comp and it didn't work and they lost the game to a team that, even though actually the rankings no longer say they are like one of the worst, problem is in our minds you think Golden Guardians, you think like that, you must have done something wrong if you lose that game. When you tie these two aspects together, the reason why someone like Bjergsen's frustrated there isn't just that fans are annoyed, it's that the label also, the very, very heavy-handed narrative always given to NA is it's the copycat region and they just find what they think other people are doing that's clever. So in the past it was Koreans, you know, they find whatever they think is the right way and then they just do it. And then the derogatory aspect of that is people that imply, you know, they're like mimicking it, but maybe they don't know why someone's doing it. And so, you know, are they doing it in a futile manner? Will they just be second best versions of that? Like, what would you say to that, Travis? The
idea that it's just copycats, is what you're saying?
No, I mean, that's what I feel like was the reason why Bjergsen is frustrated then
I
when
think
people
that's part
do
of
innovate.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think of...
I think that's part of it. I think for a long, like, it's that I think is kind of like the armchair analyst approach, where and we've had people call into Hotline League like this, where they say, well, very clearly the NA players just copy Korea, which is interesting because I think... my understanding from talking to people is that they look at a lot of the different regions and maybe they don't do as much of it as they could, but I think oftentimes they do come up with some of their own ideas as well. So I think it's weird. I'm not sure it's necessarily true. And I do agree with him that it's weird that when we try to do different things, like the whole thing, Mark and I were both frustrated this way. I think Mark talked about it on the analyst desk, and I think we talked about it on our show, is that at the start of the split, the teams were actually just playing standard, and they weren't innovating enough. So to see the frustration that occurs whenever it is not surprising to me to see both Bjergsen and Doublelift speak out whenever we have a Rift Rivals where we see standard play is not always the best route. Then you go and try to innovate on stuff. You get bashed for it online, and people mock the coach for their draft and stuff. It can be kind of annoying, I imagine.
Okay. Right. Okay. One aspect on that topic, though, that I actually find a little bit weird is, like, first of all, just as an aside, anyone who thinks they have found a reason that is all-encompassing for a massive topic, like why do 10 teams of differing players and lineups every year in League of Legends for half a decade have certain results? If you feel like you found one factor, I'll give you like a little bit of insight as to how like the mind works. All you've done is eliminate all the other factors that you should probably be considering. Like if you reduce anything down, it's like this old joke, okay, that sometimes people can show you in a major metropolitan city that the layout of a certain area forms like like 5 churches form like a hexagram or something, Now there's an old joke that says you can make that work with any city as long as the map is small enough and the marker pen is big enough. Yeah. That's like the logic I would just say to that. Like, it's very unlikely there's one reason as to why NA sucks and it's like their solo queue or they all just copy, I don't think everyone copies. Like, I actually think if you look at some of the drastic differences between NA and Korea. So, for example, I've seen NA do way more funnel strats than I've seen in Korea in many of the games in Korea, by the way, runs best of 3. So if I had to guess, I would go more down on the side of, I would assume within the little ecosystem of, if you imagine NA as a pond and Korea is a different pond elsewhere, in their little ecosystem, what they're doing does work against their teams they're playing against. So they go, right, well, that works. So what am I going to do on the official LCS game? Probably the thing that works for me in practice. So yes, certainly there's a different style that might exist halfway around the world. But if no one can execute that in your region, then it might actually open up something that works for you that wouldn't work there. So I think to me, that makes a lot more sense. What I want to ask, though, is this, Kelsey, is how much stock do you put in that as a general pattern? Okay, it doesn't have to apply to every team. But I know on the past episodes, you did criticize NA for like sort of tunnel visioning too much on the idea of funnel being the correct way to play. Do you think that there has been a lack of innovation in NA? Or have people been like too close-minded and thinking like this is what works now, so just do that? Where would you come down on that?
So I was like highlighting funnel strat specifically where they were just copying it without understanding how to play it or how to play it well. And I still think that that's mostly the case. But at this point, I think most of the NA teams have moved on from that, partly because, the patch changed, but also even last week before the patch change, we saw that like teams were not doing it as much. 100 Thieves were still doing it. There were a couple of other teams still doing it, but it wasn't nearly as like, it was weird at the time when I made the comment where literally everyone was trying it and they were trying it and it didn't work. And so that they needed that to kind of figure out what was wrong. And I do think that in general, there is in North America, it's a little bit more, it seems at times a little bit more difficult for them to specifically nail down why something is good before they test it on stage, which is fine, because that's not North America's specific problem. A lot of teams are like this, but it seems like I hear a lot of, well, they're doing it because the Koreans are doing it type of approach. At the same time, however, I do think that North American teams weren't necessarily just copycats this split. I think that like them sticking with standard bot lanes was good, but they kind of like dropped it as soon as, Heimerdinger shows up. Now standard bot lanes are both ever since Rift Rivals. Standard ADCs have been played more and more and more and more. So there are things that I think North America need to learn a little bit to stick to their guns, or at least like elucidate why something is good before deciding to just like throw the baby out with the bathwater. So
okay. Right, Travis, another thing that is obviously perfect, conversation bit for any type of an interview that's post-match now is the topic of whether or not the new meta is... basically, it's almost like giving a survey to them every time. They can pick, do they like it? Do they think it's good? Is innovation good? Does it suck? Is this innovation bad? They can go a lot of ways depending on whether they won the match, whether their team's doing well, whether their team adapts. What's your current sense for where people are at? Because obviously another thing I want to track is, okay, it's one thing at the beginning of the split where you haven't played any official games and you're not really sure how it's going to go. But, we're now over halfway through the split, so... is there a consensus that's come down? Do people actually like the new meta? Do the top pros dislike it? Like, do the old guard that used to be the best hate it because they're not on top? Where would you come down on that?
Yeah, we're referencing a lot of the things that I talked about in my Thorin interview today, which is kind of funny. But it was interesting because there were a couple AD carries, for instance, that really liked the change and the fact that there were opportunities to play different things when this patch hit. And then there were a lot of people that were frustrated by the changes, right? Like, they don't want to play Heimerdinger or mages or whatever. Interestingly, it sounds like that has changed a lot, and that in a lot of cases, like, there are external factors that are forcing these guys to play stuff. Like, Deathly said that he didn't want to play Heimerdinger, and then Xpecial, who's his position coach, basically forced him to do a ton of it. And now, they've had pretty good success with him playing that and other mages. So I think it's one of those things where you don't want to read it, or you don't want to watch this movie. You're like against the idea of watching this TV show, but then you get into it and you're like, oh, well, now I'm like super into it.
Okay.
I think that's sort of what we're seeing, is that people don't like change, or they don't like having to take on a new project, but once they get into it, they like it. And so I think that's what's happening with a lot of the pro players. The one thing I've heard consistently, though, is that they wish that these changes were not put out so quickly before the start of the split. And ideally that this is the type of change that you would see take place in the off season. Like, Worlds comes around, everything's done, and then you're good, right? Like, I don't know. It has been interesting as an aside to hear, and Duncan, I think it would be great if you can illuminate me. Maybe this is not related, but it's been interesting to hear about how NYXL had this amazing run in Overwatch League throughout like the entirety of the season, and then lost at the very end, in part because of a patch that came out that really changed the way the game works. And is that a good thing, right? Should teams that have these amazing storylines get screwed because there's such a big meta shift at the end?
Like, basically, I'll give you the equivalent. Like, it's obviously going to be incredibly hard to make a League of Legends analog analogy here, but I'll give you one that vaguely fits. So basically, the player who was the hands-down MVP of the Overwatch League, because obviously that's like the regular season award, he hasn't. Sure. I don't think it's actually been announced yet, but almost certainly will be a player for the NYXL called Jonak. And the reason why he was the MVP is because while there were meta shifts during the season itself, one thing that remained constant until basically coming sort of now into the playoffs was you could always run a character called Zenyatta, who's a character who can heal, but in his particular case, this guy was so mechanically ludicrously good with it, he was actually doing like damage with it and like carrying games as well. So my only analogy I can really give there is if you think of in like season 2 and season 3, when Mad Life came along, and everyone else who was a support player was like a Janna or fucking Sona player who had no gold, no items, and literally just placed spots and tried to like draw aggro from the AD carry so their AD carry didn't die. Instead, along came Mad Life, a guy with like ridiculous mechanics for that position, who was making all these crazy plays on Blitzcrank and then Thresh. And we all remember at the time it seemed like, holy shit, how is the support doing this? Like, is a support player the best player in the world? You had a lot of crazy conversations going on, right? Imagine if it'd been like that, but just for the regular split. And then when the playoffs came, somehow all playmaking / offensive supports just weren't even in the game anymore. I mean, they are literally in Overwatch, but like people just aren't playing it. And so you switch instead. So even though this player is still a fabulous player and can do different things, his entire team was set up for the whole season around playing off what he could do on this one hero, which now basically you don't play in that kind of a setting. So that is pretty wild, because obviously in their setting, this probably the silliest thing I think Blizzard did with Overwatch League is they themselves downplayed the little playoffs that are at the end of each of the stages, rather than make it like, you know, a stage is equivalent to a split in LCS, and we just have 4 of them, and we have 4 little playoffs. And so I would have personally done it that way, because then it could have been comparable to, like, in the past, for example, in Dota. I mean, I know they changed the format last year, so it's going to sound weird if no one followed it a few years ago, but if you go back 2 or 3 years in Dota, they had TI, that's the World Championship, and then they had like 3 or 4 majors each year, and then they had the other tournaments as well, so, you know, they had the normal circuit. But the key thing there was, yes, your main goal is win TI, but if you don't win TI, the next main goal is win majors. And if, say, for example, the winner of TI is a fluke winner, then you can still decide who the best team in the year was by who won the most majors, or, you know, by aggregate had the best placings. Like, it was a pretty good system to kind of determine all aspects. You can have the big winner, you can have the consistent team, you have something to keep focusing on. But the dumb thing they did in the Overwatch League is they themselves even downplayed the significance of the playoffs, and in fact made it have the stage playoffs, in fact made it have no relevance on the overall playoffs, and therefore those just felt like sort of like they were cool for like a day, but then no one cares at the end, for example, that NYXL won 2 of them and was in the finals of all of them because they didn't make the final of the Overwatch League. So they really did put all their eggs in one basket, and then, as you're alluding to, do a harsh meta switch, along with it not being in a setting where they did it during sort of like a mini off season before the playoffs. So as a result, you didn't even have games to test what works. And in their case, they also use the same thing as LCS, where if you're like the top seed, you skip to the semis. Sure. So as a result, it was even worse for the NYXL team, because they only got to find out that what they'd been practicing didn't work in the real game itself. Now, I will say the format's incredibly robust. It was like a best of 3 of best of 5s. So they still can't be like, oh, it was bad luck or whatever. No, they were outplayed. But that is a hell of a clusterfuck if you're trying to build like a sport, you know. And
so and that's kind of my point, right? It's like, it's interesting because, like, devs like to talk about how you have these 2 things, right? A dev, a publisher, likes to talk about how the best team should be able to adapt to these types of changes, and we all like to pretend that the best team is just the best team, right?
Yes.
But then we also kind of do these things where we're like, well, the meta is kind of favorable for this team, or, oh, this player, like, he's looking really good right now because it's his meta, or, oh, he just can't play tank top laner, so that's why he looks like garbage right now. So it's actually really hard, I think, in esports across the board, and to some extent, I think the ADC changes play into this, where, you know, I don't think the game should ever be unchanging, but we have to be really careful about the balance, because you want to be able to tell stories about consistently good players who are good, players who can, and if you make these dramatic changes where the game plays so differently, like, what if we lived in a world where, like, all marks, like, Reckless's world, I don't know if this is true, but Reckless, in his opinion, like, all marksmen are just constantly the worst thing to play compared to mages and tanks, right? Yes. There's just no world in which that is better. You can debate whether or not that's the case, but, like, you end up in a world where now Reckless, a all-star player and a face of EU LCS, is not playing. That's bad, in my opinion, for the sport. Sure. And so that's what's interesting. Conversely, I guess one of the other sides is that Deathly is probably getting more attention than he ever has in his career, because he seems to be showing pretty good performance, you know, not just on the AD carries, but also in these mages. And he's got, I think, he's #1 KDA right now, or something like that.
Okay.
So it's a weird situation where, look, I do think a lot of people are enjoying the meta, and they think it's interesting and exciting, and it's cool that after all these years, Riot is creating more versatility in the bot lane, for instance. But I think it's also hard, because when you release stuff like this, I mean, better for them to release that patch at the beginning of the summer split than like right before summer playoffs. But whether it is them releasing a huge patch in the middle of the season, or it is Blizzard releasing a pretty significant meta change right before the playoffs, you run the risk that you're going to end up like really screwing over the stories that you're trying to tell and the players that you're highlighting by putting them in such a disadvantaged situation.
What do you think, Kelsey?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird, because we had the whole thing with the Juggernaut patch change, right, in 2015 Worlds, and then we had the lane swap change in 2016, and Riot were saying, okay, we're going to be more careful. And I actually kind of overall liked how they did balance changes in 2017, where they had like some changes in the middle of 2017 summer that seemed drastic, but they weren't that big in the grand scheme of things. Otherwise, they focused on like, okay, we're going to change a bit of stuff in the mid-season invitational, or try to put like the main meta changes in off-season. And I thought that wasn't a bad setup. And then here, they have basically already admitted that they went a little overboard, having like 3 gigantic patches in the middle of the time between MSI and the new season, all in one go, which created all sorts of changes that they hadn't necessarily anticipated. And they basically already have said that like they didn't necessarily think that was the best approach. And the weirdest thing though is how they basically, if you look at PBE, they're rolling back a lot of the cost changes and stuff that they did. They're not rolling back everything for AD carry itemization. So it's like almost like the conclusion is that they don't necessarily like what they did with bot lane, and they're rolling it back quite a bit. If these changes come through, to say, okay, well, we'll put standard ADCs back there, which is, I don't necessarily think the conclusion Riot should be drawing. They should be more drawing, okay, we made this change in a bad time. We should not do something like that with the timing again. But if they want to open up the bot lane more, I don't necessarily think that's bad for the game. You know, it's just all about the timing of it.
It's also hard because when you make these changes back and forth so frequently, if I'm a player, do I think they're going to bring marksman back and thus I should continue to focus on marksman? Or should I invest my time in building out the mage roster, because that is going to be, they're here to stay? It's kind of weird in that.
It's basically the Forgiven paradox, Travis, which is that he basically when he had a particular season, I think it was season 5, maybe the one where he was with Gambit, right? Famously, there wasn't many like sort of ADC champions that he liked to play, like, you know, lane dominant. And at the time, it was when people were playing a lot of like the utility AD carries, etc. And famously, everyone used to just say, okay, but that doesn't work for Given, because if you go watch all the carry players that are like you in LPL, for example, they play Callista, which was the champion that was the most OP for doing that shit. And his argument used to be, Travis, that he did this for like 6 months straight. Yeah, but it's so OP, I'm certain it's going to be banned. Therefore, why should I bother learning to play it? Which is like, that there's a sort of internal logic there, but it's also bullshit, because you have sort of created a scenario that no one has said is happening, but we have to accept the premise to listen to the rest of the logic. But if we accept the premise, then we're just buying into your logic anyway. So it didn't work, by the way, in case anyone wants a spoiler. Callista continued to be played, and he even played it the next year. So even future Forgiven found out that wasn't correct.
Right. Yeah, it's just a weird conundrum, and it's hard because pro players are such at the whim of these developers and designers. And at one point in time, somebody over lunch with some of their colleagues could say, you know, we've had marksman in the bot lane exclusively for so long. It's not really like that in any other lane. Maybe we should add some versatility. Or, I was playing Dota the other day, and I like the fact that you can have these different characters in different lanes. And then all of a sudden your life has been turned upside down. And part of it is that good players should be able to navigate those waters and all that. But I think,
can I ask why that's part of the definition of what is a good player, actually? Like, that
they can adapt to the meta, you mean?
Yeah, because
I personally never understood that, mate.
Let me broaden this out.
Okay.
So Link, I think you can make a really broad comment here, right? We always focus on players who are really good in a single game, because that's how the ecosystem works right now. It is already some of the most impressive people to me. Xmithie's like this as well. Players who are really good across a lot of different games. Like, from my understanding, Xmithie plays a lot of Fortnite, and Xmithie is very good at Fortnite. And it is and Link supposedly is like really good at Hearthstone. That was a big meme for a while. But then also he has got
Overwatch he played as well, right?
What's that? Yeah.
He tried playing that semi-pro.
Well, I know he also plays a lot of Dota.
It might have been Dota then. Okay.
So that, like, I do think that we should celebrate players who are maybe we don't need to go so broad to say that we are celebrating players who are so good at all the different games. I do like it if you have a player who's just like Huni should be celebrated for the fact that he can play in all these different roles now that we've got them this opportunity. I think that's interesting. I think it shows a skill set that is maybe broader. You know, we celebrate champion pools and champion depth. So why not celebrate the ability to be versatile and be able to play quickly?
See, I don't necessarily disagree with including it as criteria. I'm just wondering why that came about, because in order to be a good player in other games, like, you don't necessarily have to adapt to a patch to be considered a good player, right?
CSGO is the best example, Kelsey, because if you really are amazing at CSGO, most of that will, as long as your actual individual level doesn't really go down, it'll just translate for years. People can be on top for literally every month for 2 years if they're the best player.
But it has become an inherent part of League of Legends because of the way League is the game. That player, you have to have like this sort of versatility because we're at the whim of that. So I just think that like the game itself and how Riot's balancing decisions have influenced how we define like skill within the game.
Yeah, that's actually a good point.
So League of Legends as balancers have said, well, a good player should be able to adapt, and it's like that has been their decision, right? It's not a chicken or an egg sort of situation. That is their decision to say that a good player should be able to adapt to a meta. And so that's what they have built into their game and the way they've set it up.
Put it this way, basically, what the meta does is it is like throwing a dart at a wall, no dartboard, and then you just draw a circle around it and go, right, there's you did a bullseye, the other guy didn't. And he's like, well, neither of us were aiming at anything. And you go, well, I've decided you were the better shot. That kind of is what it's like, because in this scenario, like, to make it a more abstract point, it's basically been proven throughout history. There are certain players who, through all the metas, roughly were good players, but there are definitely players who get elevated to way better than they normally are for like one split, and there are definitely teams that have a much better run and then never do as well. So it does seem as though a lot of that is just after the fact, looking at the result, and then in hindsight saying, right, well, you won, so you were the better team or the better players. Yeah. Like, I do think it is kind of like a flawed definition in a way. But as you say, it's just the pragmatic nature of the world, that we have to call the teams that are on top the best.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just, I still stand by the idea that it's nice to celebrate players who have the intellectual capacity and the grind and the drive to quickly learn a different type of play style. I think there is something to be celebrated there in terms of, like, the one guy, like, we do this even with one tricks, right? Like, we don't like one tricks. We think one tricks are not something that should be celebrated because, sure, anybody can grind away at one champion, but being able to quickly, rapidly learn something else, that is something that we think is a good skill set. But I do agree with Kelsey's point and see it where, like, at a certain point in time, you can crank up that dial on, like, how much we celebrate it. And maybe part of the reason it's like a cultural thing, right? Like the culture of League of Legends, the environment, you're changing it so often. If the game became something where every single day the game was played differently, then the best players would suddenly be the people who can just, like, learn a champion over the course of 2 hours really good before a tournament happens. So
Ash becomes the best player in the world.
There's a balance there.
I have a question related to this, though, Kelsey. I want to get your take on it. It's basically an update on past episodes when we've discussed the differing meta over the split, which, as you alluded to with your point earlier about Funnel and NA, has definitely changed even within the whatever it's been. Like, has it been 6 weeks LCS or something? We haven't had that long a period of time, but we've seen so many drastic shifts back and forwards just in terms of how the teams choose to play it, not even necessarily the game itself changing. So I wanted to get your update on this, on the marksman topic.
Sure.
And is in this sense, okay. So one of my reasons why I often was on your side of the equation with, for example, saying to someone like Reckless, like, listen, man, like, you can't keep telling us in interviews you have to play mages when every week I'm watching LCK and I'm watching, for example, Katie Rolster, Kingzone Dragon X. They're just playing normal AD carries, even the ones that are like traditional ones, and they are winning most of their games and they are fabulous teams. Like that, like, you basically just, you're not lying, but you're just saying something that is counter to different, some facts over in a different part of the game. So it may be not possible for you in Europe, I don't know, but it certainly is possible overall. Now, an update on that, Kelsey, is this. So the main thing I noticed that Reddit people always said whenever this topic came up, like, oh, is a player complaining that you can't play marksman, or do you have to play mages, or you have to learn, have to practice support and mage? What people always said was, because they don't watch LCK, they said, no, but Misfits is undefeated in Europe, and the Misfits AD carrier, Hans Sama, just plays AD carries, and it's fine. Update for you. Hans Sama himself has now just said in an interview, the quote was, I've had a lot less impact in recent weeks. If the meta stays, I will pick up mages too. What's your thoughts to that? Like, have we seen, so you can't just play standard as like a default position now?
So first of all, let's look at the quote. I haven't seen the interview, so I'm a Redditor today. And the quote says that he feels a lot less impactful. I think that was more the goal of the patch than anything, was to make the AD carry bot lane role, marksman, whatever you want to call it, feel less impactful. And I think that is true whether you're playing mages or you're playing AD carries. In the bot lane, is that you will feel less impactful than you did in spring, when it was literally better bot lane wins every game. But
he does imply with the second sentence that he thinks mages might be better.
Yeah, I mean, he thinks they are, but my question is, do you think that you'll feel like you'll have a much bigger impact as a mage, or do you just feel like your role in general has less impact? Because if he hasn't really been practicing mages, maybe he doesn't realize that like the mage bot players are not.
The bot lane just plays, and he's looking at
the bot lane is less impactful than it was in spring, and I think that that's true in general. Whether we're looking at bot lane mage players or bot lane AD carries, is that bot lane is less impactful than it was in spring, for sure.
Okay. Just want to get an update on that, since obviously I don't know when we're the next EU one.
But globally, the rate of ADs bot has increased in the past couple of weeks. The win rate of ADs is above 50%. Like standard bot lanes is above 50%. So, I don't know.
Travis, bizarrely, because if you come from the old school of LCS, this wasn't a thing. There's been quite a lot of drama around mid-season roster moves. Like I alluded to, that just wasn't a thing in the early days of the LCS. If you had the 5 players, you tended to just play out the split, come hell or high water, and it didn't matter if you thought, oh, they should get a jungler. No one really expected you were going to make a change during the split. So let's talk about the most recent one here, because the reason why I thought this would be an interesting topic to bring up with you is I know from behind the scenes that Cloud9 are one of the more open orgs. Like, they will tell people stuff. Certainly players in LCS seem like they're fairly open behind the scenes to telling people what they think of a move or what's going on in the team. What do you think of this blockbuster move with Smoothie going over to Echo Fox and then Echo Fox dumping Phoenix?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I had not heard
swap, but yeah.
I had heard that Smoothie was potentially on the market,
right?
Which implied to me that Jack just felt like he wasn't going to be using Smoothie for the rest of the split, which is interesting. So I think it's there's a couple different things here. One, I'm kind of surprised we're not seeing more mid-season roster moves. I think maybe we would in a world where like all the teams weren't so neck and neck, because I think the system now favors risk takers in a way that it didn't before.
In terms of the meta?
I think because of the lack of relegation.
Right. Okay.
So I think, and I think it's two things, right?
So if you start losing, just already blow it up and try and get the
right. Like basically. If you are not going to make it to World, what are you risking here? And like if you think right now you've got a 30% chance of making it to Worlds, and you're really looking to get that up to 50%, and you know you have like a 50-50 chance you can make here. Like, okay, we bring this guy in, he might get us to that 50-50 odds. He might get us down to 10%. We might tank. You're not worried about relegation, so you're not worried about taking moves that will perhaps make your team worse. I think also one of the arguments that we've been making recently on Hotline League and that I've really enjoyed is that there's a theoretical argument. I'm not saying I'm making this, but there's a theoretical argument that TSM right now should have tried to pick up Meteos or make a roster change.
Sure.
Because they like they should be dissatisfied with groups, right? They showed that they were unhappy with groups because they'd had a roster that could get them there 2 years in a row. So they were going to make changes to do that. I do not think that if you look at their roster right now, that it is one. Maybe somebody will play this video whenever they win Worlds this year. But I do not think that this is a roster where they should feel really confident thinking like, oh yeah, this year we've really upgraded. So they should be dramatically making changes here because they should be taking risks to get them beyond where they've gone before. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, one, the idea of roster changes is more open. That's why I think... I disagree that 100 Thieves should feel great about making a roster change because right now success for them should look like getting to Worlds. But I think with teams like Echo Fox and others, the whole system just favors risks more, right? You're safer with a risk. The downsides are less bad. And I think NA needs to go further than they have before. That's where you're going to get celebrated. So you should make changes to get yourself there.
Okay. What do you think of this move, Kelsey?
Kelsey?
I think she died.
She's dumbfounded.
Oh, are you back?
I
back?
think it's... Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go for it.
Yeah. All right. So I think that the smoothie move is really good for Echo Fox. I think it's really good for Smoothie. I don't really know what's good for Cloud9 anymore, and I'm not sure they do either. So I guess from that perspective, it's a good move. That's where I'd put it. In terms of the idea of TSM should be making radical, like I can't think of a roster move that would get them out of groups this year, just in general. I can't think of a roster.
TSM Medios.
Yeah, I am aware that was the segment on your show, Travis. Yes, I don't really think Medios would get them out of groups. And
you don't think it's worth a gamble?
I don't think Medios will get them out of groups, and I think it's better for them to stick with a jungler they think that they can build up or integrate better with the team. That will be a better investment for next year, and then they get out of groups next year. I don't know.
That's a fair argument. I do, again, like in a risk-taking environment, I think that it'd be interesting for them to take a risk. I think the Medios thing is more fanciful and fun to talk about, but I do get your point that maybe there aren't that many better options for them to move forward with.
Travis, what about this?
I think Mark on Hotline Lead put it as tactfully as you could, in the sense that Medios, in terms of his mentality and approach, won't necessarily fit the image that TSM at least tries to project, right?
Yeah.
So
that's fair.
From that perspective, I don't think Medios on TSM makes it out of groups at Worlds. And then they sign Medios, and everyone plays the segment, and Travis and I both look like idiots, and it's awesome regardless. So
I don't think anyone's playing any of these segments, to be fair, so let's just play to the crowd that's actually watching now. Right, here's the question, Travis. The reason why that's significant, though, is in a world where you could make a signing like this, there's a player available, that actually, in the past, would play right into the TSM hands, because TSM was the org where they were all about winning this split. They were all about going to whatever the international competition was. They were all about winning now, and that obviously, people have seen this, came from Reginald as sort of a culture throughout the org. So this year, when I did my interview with Reginald before the year began, he did try to emphasize that, he was going to try and delegate more, and he was really going to try and let the coaches run the team more, and he wasn't going to step in the way he did in the past. But is this actually the outcome of that? Is the sort of a more laid back approach and sort of a more long-term thing and a developing players and trying out now two different junglers that again look like development players? Do you think this is actually just the philosophy that TSM has?
That they wouldn't pick up a player, or do you think that their current results are
as in they've become a team that now are actually like overtly trying to be like more of a long-term project, rather than before what they used to do was a lot of band-aid fixes, like let's just fix something that works tomorrow.
The funny thing is that like I feel like they would say that they've been a long-term team for a while. I guess that's maybe not what Andy said in your interview, but like it's weird because the decision to keep to keep Peter and Biofrost around for the next year when they went again, that feels like okay, we didn't make it out of groups, we're now going to keep this roster to try to like develop it and get it into a good place. And you could make equally the same argument where it's like, okay, we have these all-star players, we got to groups, we're now going to make a change to like progress ourselves beyond groups. So I don't know. I don't think they pick up Grig because they're like, I think if you want a team that is thinking long term and they're like, yeah, we're multi-year approach to doing well at Worlds, you're looking at a Golden Guardians, or maybe a FlyQuest, which admittedly hasn't communicated that ever in the way FlyQuest has, but the way Golden Guardians has, but maybe that's what they're trying to do. I think you look at the teams that are building up talent rather than the ones that are locking in existing talent. And I think they pick up Grig only because they don't have another option in that spot, or they don't feel like they know anybody else that's good.
I mean, I don't think you just go the full-on Golden Guardians approach either, because you have to have them. You still want vetted talent. You still want a mix of players that you think will make the best team in the long term. And I think having a mix of rookies and veterans is very beneficial, actually. So, especially if you have a long-term investment project, as long as there's synergy, as long as there's some sense of direction. So,
sure. I don't know. I think this is what happened with TSM. I think they picked up Mike Young, who was a promising rookie. They picked up these two best in the West bot lane, and they felt like the mythy equations flying around his face whenever he's playing the game. I think that they felt like this was a winning combination, and it has turned out that it's not. And I don't. Yeah, I mean, Kelsey.
I'm just saying I don't disagree with that. I just think that now that they're looking at the pieces, it's like, yeah, Greg, we think can be a good player for next year or something, and that's.
I see what you're saying. In coming out of spring, they've decided there's not an easy fix to make it further at Worlds, and this is where they've landed.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, Thorin, to answer your question, yes, they are now a long-term development org, but not because they decided to do that, but because coming out of spring, they're like, yes, long-term development org. That's we're building talent, and we're going to make it out of groups next year.
Which, by the way, that is how branding is successfully done. You can't swim against the stream on that one. You got to just go with the flow. So well done to Reggie on that one.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, also worked the other way in the past. Like that whole thing of like, we're a short-term org wouldn't work if you then didn't win all the splits or get to the finals. So I guess, again, it sort of just worked out that way. What about this then? So Travis, when you alluded to before, the fact that 100 Thieves move is a little bit more of an interesting one, because if anything, that looks more like the move where it's like, we're looking what's the best for the long-term health of the team, because a lot of people would say Meteor's one of the best junglers in the league. If you just want to win games now, find a way to, keep him, try and get his motivation back, or fix whatever personal issue has caused this dispute. What do you think of where the 100 Thieves org's going on that one?
Yeah, I really wonder. It's weird because I have not watched the most recent episode of The Heist, which is where they tend to tackle this stuff. So I should probably have watched that before having this conversation. So just understand that I preface this by saying some of this is born out of ignorance, but I wonder what happened there, because like Meteos, when I interviewed him, he referred to the thing as like a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. Maybe he was expressing frustration. Like maybe in a moment of anger, he said like, I want to switch teams, or I want to look at other teams because this isn't working. And he expected, and maybe they were like calling him on his bluff essentially by doing this. I don't know. It just like, it still strikes me as such a weird move, because in interviewing Prawley, it doesn't feel like this was a decision he made. Which is really weird because they had given him so much roster control before. Maybe he's just trying to cover his ass, but it feels weird for them to make this decision without Prawley involved. And I don't know how much Nadeshot was involved in the decision. There's just a lot of open questions, again, that maybe are answered in this show that I haven't watched, but I don't think that a org that had as much experience in the who had more experience in the LCS would be making that move. So I don't know if that's because these guys, like, maybe there's an ego thing there. Meteos isn't happy, and they're like, well, you're not happy in our amazing home, like, get out. Or if it's because they just feel like they can find talent to replace them really quickly, or because they just don't feel like they have the way to fix the problem. I don't know, but I don't see this decision being made by a more experienced org.
The part that, to me, what I still think is, like, I don't know if the org and player know that no one really understands this element of the story, but their whole thing of like, oh, it was just crossed wires and miscommunication. The part where that doesn't work is, remember, they tried to present it as like, oh no, Meteos getting angry doesn't make sense actually because he wanted to be traded. But then at the same time claiming that like, maybe we just forgot to tell him that he wasn't going to be a starter. Like, I'm calling you bullshit on that one. So you thought that he wanted to leave a team where he's a starter, one of the best teams in the league, and go and play for what at the time was one of the worst teams and not be a starter. You're really trying to sell me that you thought that that's what Meteos want. Like, that part doesn't make sense at all. Like, I don't know if they're aware of like the disconnect between how that's coming off and how like everyone else thinks about that part of the story, because that's the part that doesn't add up.
If you think about it, this seems like, I know they had a scandal in CSGO, but at least on the league side, I think this is like the first, like, 100 Thieves may be a victim of their own success here, in that in the league scene, everybody, they come up, I don't know if even Immortals had as much success from like a branding perspective, fan gathering perspective. They like just knocked it out of the park when it came to the launch of their brand and their team.
Sure.
And then they kind of had this first stumble, and I don't know if because everything had been going so well, I don't know if they knew how to like appropriately handle the stumble. And so I think they've kind of just like bungled it, and maybe they just kind of wanted to go away at this point in time. It didn't seem like I tried to get an interview about the topic, and they seemed to kind of just like duck the whole thing. Probably eventually did do one with me, so shout out to Probably, but I don't know. I think 100 Thieves, it didn't go the way they expected. I don't think they expected Meteos to broadcast it the way he did. And I think that they've just kind of like tried to sweep it under the rug as quickly as possible, move on the other side of this. And I do think that they'll take a reputation hit in the short term.
Has it been worth it, Kelsey? Like, actually have their conceits been borne out? Like, has the fact that they've still won games, they've still done all right, has that made it that you can believe in a world where it was the right move to remove Meteos, and going forwards, whether or not this player is good enough, it's, you know, the direction's the right one? What do you take there on?
Kelsey?
I don't think she can hear
us.
There we go.
It's interesting to me that this is like the second time we've had like a kerfuffle involving Meteos with like, oh, but this player was benched, but we really want this player, and then Adrian goes somewhere because he apparently said something about I don't know what happened, but it's interesting to me that this is like the second time we've had this kind of problem. I don't know if there's just an issue with his communication with orgs or orgs communicating with him, but it's really an interesting one. So should be a fun time.
It's a situation where I don't know if Meteos has an agent, but in a more mature system, I think there's probably a conversation there where like the org goes to an agent and has like a conversation like, hey, like, is this guy in it or not? And the agent maybe like checks in to like make sure that everything is fine. Like it does feel like a situation where a third party maybe could have like operating between the two could have helped to resolve the situation. Again, having a lot of ignorance on what happened.
I also think that esports agents, so if there was an agent involved, esports agents aren't really exactly evolved to a point where I would recommend
down the road. Yeah.
Yeah, the current ones. So yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So what about this then? So another org that I wanted to discuss is obviously Cloud9, because the bizarre thing is, like, they are bottom of the league. They are, admittedly, they're still 3 games from the top because of how close the league is, but actually, obviously, 3 games is a lot when you only play 18, so that's not as close as 2 games is. But obviously Cloud9's moves, I mean, at this point in time, they've tried every move. They've benched people, they've brought back some of the stars. Generally, nothing seems to have taken the swift upturn they want. Kelsey, what do you think of where Cloud9 as an org is at, or what they're doing, or general thoughts on this bizarre scenario?
I think that Cloud9 are used to being second or third best, occasionally first in NALCS, so they don't necessarily know how to deal with being not in that position. And that's where they are now.
Travis. Oh, sorry. Yeah, keep going.
I was just saying, because if you think about it, Cloud9 aren't really a team that had like drastic improvements, or like the meta kind of swung in their favor a lot of times when they stuck with like a certain roster for a while, and then that did really, really well for them, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like now they don't really exactly know how to get to a point in a new meta or in a new environment where they're on top again. So,
all right, Travis, one thing about this particular topic that does drive me crazy, I mean, it kind of ties into what we were just talking about with the 100 Thieves thing, is the total lack of transparency of who is pulling the trigger on moves and decisions, right? Because
I mean, they were very transparent in some ways.
Yes, but I actually hate it where people like hide behind the whole thing of like, well, we as an org thought like, no, sorry, there's someone within the org that is delegated to make a decision or to make a recommendation, and someone else pulls the trigger on it. So is it your sense that, for example, Reaper is the one who's choosing the direction and who plays, and he really is kind of the brains behind this? Yeah,
I think so. It's interesting. I feel like there has been a lot of transparency there in that. I think Jack has said, and maybe this is just what he's saying, but Jack has said that Reaper came to him and said, like, these guys aren't going to make it work, right? Like, it is weird because I actually feel for the org a little bit in this situation, because I agree with I think it is potentially likely that the three players felt really content, kind of goofed off, and they felt like the coach needed to like lay the smackdown on them. And Jack decided to support that decision. And by the way, like you were tweeting about this recently on, you and I are on opposite ends of the spectrum here. And quite frankly, I'm not interested in getting a holy war with you about it, but I do think that it is a good idea for a coach to be able to say, you are not putting in the effort that I need you to put in. You are not performing at the skill level that you need to be performing at. I will bench you until you can give me what I need you to give me.
Travis, you actually have misunderstood my position on that, because to be fair, it's just a tweet, so it's not like a whole thing you can find.
140 characters, I know exactly where you stand on this.
Here's the very simple thing. I totally agree with it in principle. In fact, if I was a coach, that is one of the things I would demand, is that I were able to potentially bench people, threaten them with that, have players that I hope I can work in the roster and therefore you compete for us. But all these things that people say, I'm on board with. My problem is this. Like, I feel like people then go and again reduce it to one factor of like, well, that's what you do. If a star player isn't going to play ball, you bench him. And it's like, well, you can, but you will lose games. Like, if you bench Jensen and you bring Golden Glue in, you are not going to be the best team in the LCS. You have now eliminated all chances of that. Now, certainly, if we're talking about like a long-term thing and we're going to be in a world where people have better subs, it might become more and more viable. And I do think, like, you notice I purposely did say it was only for superstars. I think you can do it for lesser players, absolutely, and players that are underperforming. The problem I have is, I don't think, especially in a world where you play 18 best of ones and that decides how you did this split, that you can fuck around saying like, sorry Dardoch, sorry Jensen, you guys actually are going to have to sit out for a few weeks to learn your lesson. Because it's like, as much as they're going to learn a lesson, you're going to learn a lesson as well, which is we're going to lose these games. And so in some senses, it, like in the short term, it becomes like cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Do you think that it would be interesting to wonder if Jensen is performing better and is a better teammate right now because of this? If you, and I say that under the assumption that he was kind of goofing off, and if that's the case, is it better to, it's interesting that Cloud9 reverted back to, not entirely, but they went back to their stars and brought Sneaky back and all that stuff at a time where it was kind of like make it or break it. Because I almost wonder if you can try to find that balance, right? Where you make the change, to hopefully improve the attitude and the commitment of the player that you need to really perform. But you only make that change until it starts to get really scary, and then you bring them back. Because theoretically, then you have maximized the chances of your player being
You get the psychological
good.
effect, but you don't take too many losses.
Right, exactly. Like you've not disqualified yourself from Worlds.
Sure.
You've reduced the chances of it, but you might have a better player, and that player might do better if you get to Worlds because of this. This is an interesting thought.
Like, here's the thing. I'm on board with that as a principle. I even think, actually, that, yeah, that might work in certain cases. In Cloud9's case, because they were losing anyway, I think it's fair enough to give it a shot. The big problem is this, though, which is in this scenario where... let me think, actually. Where was I going with that? I think I got thrown off at the end there.
Sure.
I think. What was the point?
You're saying you believe with it in principle.
Yeah, where was I going with that? Because I had a point to make on that one. Let me think. Oh, here's the point. The reason why I don't think that that applies as much in the Jensen case, though, is because, as I also said in the tweet, actually, to me, the problem with that scenario is, again, it's such a... You're basically examining one factor. The factor is this. Is the player being the kind of teammate that we want? Is he responsive to coaching, right? And if you judge that as the one factor, you then have a flow chart, and it says, if no, bench him. If yes, allow him to continue playing. And this is the problem with that premise, in my opinion, to why I think it's not actually I think it's a little bit disingenuous as a premise, is because if you have a player who's played in your team for 3 years, he has been the best player, the star player, the franchise player. He also has a close relationship with the owner, and the owner seems very happy with him, hence why he re-signs him every year. I actually would go ahead and say there, perhaps this is a scenario where either Jensen's had some weird, completely out of the blue attitude problem that's come out of nowhere, seemingly, because they couldn't anticipate this over the years he's been the team of the past. Therefore, you're now benching, because it's different, if you start a new line. Like, if you're the team that's just signed Dardoch and he misbehaves in week 2, like, that is different from if he's in your team for 3 years and he's cool, and then he goes out of nowhere, he just goes nuts. So the other aspect I would suggest then is, that makes me feel like it's also potentially something you can't fix in terms of player and coach. Like, maybe your coach and the way your coach deals with players like him just doesn't align. And so as a result, maybe they're both good. Maybe the coach is good, maybe Jensen's good, but Jensen has to play for a different team and Reaped needs to have a different mid laner. Because in this scenario, if you've been with a guy that long and you're Reaped, I'm kind of worried if you can't get him to buy into being the franchise player and lead him by example, doing all the stuff you need, Normally, like you've never heard this story with Bjergsen, for example. There's never been a story like, oh, Bjergsen, it's like acting out. And
but you have heard the story with it. Like, I do think that there's a chance here where people get distracted, their priorities change. The frequent one that everyone likes to kind of mutter about underneath their breath is like a pro player gets a girlfriend and suddenly they want to spend a ton of time with the girl. So yes, I do see what you mean.
That can be one of the elements of a player's downfall.
Yeah, right. Is that and I mean that not because women are the devil, but because it's just a distraction,
Divided
right?
Attention,
people can have stuff pop up in their life all the time, and a relationship is a great example of something that can change your priorities. So it could be a situation where the org is it's just an incompatible moment. I do think, though, that sort of to flip your point on its head, if you have had a relationship with a player and they have been consistent for so long, and you suddenly have a world where they are not putting the priorities in place, maybe it's just a situation where they've just slipped a little bit, or they've had something else pop up in their life, or you need to they've fallen so far by the wayside and slipped a little bit over time that you really have to try to push them back in. And it's impossible for us to say anything because we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes, but it's an interesting topic nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, to riff off of that, I don't necessarily think all the C9 players were benched for the same reason, or that we all had the full story. But at the same time, if you're just taking a hypothetical situation where you have the franchise player who's acting up, we have 3-year contracts, and 3-year contracts means this org has made a commitment to me, this is happening. So saying we're willing to bench you can also be a wake-up call in that scenario. So that's basically, but also saying, oh, okay, we're only going to keep you benched, and then if they lose games while the player is benched and then suddenly put him back in, like maximizing the time, I don't think that's fooling anyone, let alone the player. So
yeah, they do seem like they're falling into like a no man's land between the two positions. It's like whichever side of the debate you come down on, act accordingly. Like it does feel as though a lot of teams say, oh, we're going to bench him for attitude, and then as you say, Travis, it's like, right, like it's like they're almost looking over their shoulder, like, are we losing the game? Right? Oh, you've had enough time out now. Come back. You've learned your lesson, right? You're ready to come back, and they're like, tell me everything I need to hear right now. You've said it all great, right? You're back. Good. It's like that classic joke of like, he's reformed. Everyone's reformed now. They're all reformed. He's fully changed. His life's different. He's thought about what he's done. I mean, to be fair, the reason why I find this funny is because it's actually a famous trope. I don't know if it's in America like this, but it's a famous trope in school in England when I grew up, that when you misbehaved, they would basically, like what they would do is they would ask you questions that were like semi-rhetorical, except you had to answer. I say semi-rhetorical because you had to answer in a specific way. So they would say, now, what have you done? And then you'd have to say like, I've misbehaved and let myself down. And then they'd be like, and have you learned? And what have you done now? Learned my lesson. And what are you not going to do next time? Not going to do the things that you told me to. But obviously, every kid who ever said those words knows, like, all you really taught me is the words to say there. And I actually haven't changed at all. I'm probably going to do the same shit anyway. But you know, you can't punish me forever. So I've got like my little punishment now, and I'll probably get another one in 2 weeks. That's really the way that worked. And I think that kind of applies to this situation a bit.
Yeah, I think it could be the case. I mean, you demonstrate it in actions, right? Like it's easy for them to say stuff, and I assume that Reaper is keeping an eye on like how much these guys are playing, and how much commitment they have to practice and what's going on there. So I don't know. I got time will tell, and ultimately, like it's interesting to wonder, did Cloud9 throw these players in because they feel like they had a change of heart, or did Cloud9 throw these players in because they felt like they would just tank all their chances at going to Worlds and it just wasn't worth it? So I don't know. It's interesting to see what the thing that'll be interesting to me. And I've been trying to pull up. I hate the Lolly Sports website. I've been trying to pull up like when the contracts expire. It's interesting to see how much longer the Cloud9 guys are under contract, because if any of them expire at the end of this year, like, did this relationship sour things so much that the players are going to be looking to go someplace else?
Right. Kelsey, do you actually think that CLG is a good team? Like in the current meta and current state of the NALCS, they're one game from the top. Are they a good team, CLG?
Sure. I mean, I think that the meta works for them because they've always been a team that has like pretty good early game plans. And I think they can really showcase that in this meta. So in that context, yeah, I think they're fine.
Because Travis, this is something that a lot of people, I think, are fans, have actually given up on with CLG, which is that they think, okay, the problem is there's two factors. One, because CLG was a lot slower than the other orgs to take outside investment, they literally didn't have the budget to go and sign massive players at certain points in time as big orgs could elsewhere. And I made a video on this topic where the concept was, it's not CLG's fault, it's just that at the time they were the equivalent of a small market basketball team that's not going to get the best player in the world. Sure. But the problem is, in your brain, you hear the word CLG and you think, should be top team, should be contending for the, There's like a difference between your expectations and the pragmatic reality, right? With the current lineup they have, especially in a world now where even Aframu's gone, I feel like a lot of fans before this split had completely given up on the idea CLG's ever going to be a top team again. They think that they're either like a budget team or that they've gone too far with the idea of like, these are cool guys who we can coach, but that they're not like ever going to be able to perform at the top level. What's actually the sense from CLG players and the CLG org? Like, where's their head at?
I mean, I think like every org, they all believe that they have the chance to make it work. But I don't know if they do, right? Like I know in the past, Peter has said like, you have to really, every player who goes on stage should feel like they can win the game. Otherwise you've lost already. And I think that's kind of, I think that CLG probably does think that they can be this world's top team. The problem is like, I have a really hard time looking at any of the players except for, I'm very partial to Biofrost just because I think he's shown a lot of skill and talent in the short time that he's been playing. I don't it's hard to look at any of those individual players and say that's the guy that's going to get you to Worlds. Like this is the team that's going to make it to Worlds, and not just like a team where you're going to slip in through Gauntlet, but like one that's actually going to show a lot of pride. All that being said, like MSI 2016 did happen. These guys have done it before. It's just hard because I think the landscape has changed, and I don't know if they've been able to keep up as much. And I think that's what all the old guard teams are struggling with, right? Like, I don't know if TSM, CLG, and Cloud9 can just sort of bully their way past all the other orgs anymore because players wanted to go to these teams because of their brands. Well, guess what? 100 Thieves is a pretty good brand.
By the way, that's a pretty key point as well, even beyond the money aspect. Like one of the things that actually meant that, for example, in the case of TSM and C9, they were just very selective with when they chose to take the investment. And in fact, I think part of when they chose to do it wasn't just franchising. It was the fact that they'd kind of gotten to the end of this like couple of years span where it wasn't even about like, we've got the most money, because they didn't anymore, but they still did get the big free agents because they're TSM and Cloud9, which is kind of what you're saying here. They had like a sort of cultural cachet to their name that meant you might still pick them even if you might get paid more to play for.
Yeah, you got a discount. TSM in particular got a discount on players. You know, like they got to pay discounted rates because people wanted to be associated with their brand. And I don't know how much longer that will last for. As an aside, I don't think that had anything to do with the money thing. I think Jack took money probably because of the Overwatch League. And I think for a lot of these teams, like the cynical calculation that they could have been making and probably should have been making was the longer we wait, the more value our brands will have and the more money we'll be able to get, right? Like taking investment now,
that's kind of the point
better
I'm
than
making.
2 years ago.
That like I think the whole I have no doubt like Steve Arnesen and Jack Etienne could have gotten the same investment as Noah Winston did the day he got it. Like if he could do it as a nobody, they definitely could have. They put, as you're saying, they wanted the pie to grow bigger so that when they gave someone a tiny sliver of it, it was a big for them, but it was the pie was way bigger for them overall. You know, they weren't selling off like a third of the company for a few million now when it could be 10 million for the same amount.
Yeah, and I actually doubt that they're taking money now because they feel like they need to spend more than everybody else. Though I do think that there's probably some part of that because
there's a bit of parity now, though, right?
Yeah. TSM can't, like, the discounts are going to start diminishing, right? And the Players Association, for as much as people mock it, has been distributing what the player salaries is to the salaries of the different players are to the other players, right? Like I think all the players now get like here's what the top paid top laner is and the bottom tier paid top laner, that's like cool. A median. So I think that's also going to hurt. The players have now more strength in understanding how much of a discount they're giving to TSM. So I think that's probably part of it, but I also think part of it is when Team Liquid and CLG announce giant training facilities, it's hard whenever you're trying to hype sponsors and you're like, come look at our apartments. They're really great. They're just right across from the McDonald's, you know? So I think there's a lot of different factors there. By the way, Thorin, I will say I do have to run in a little bit, but super happy to keep talking. I probably got another 5 minutes or so.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. Kelsey, then just give us your thoughts on that topic and we'll close on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's good that players are receiving salaries and this is what's coming out. I think that we have still seen, however, that teams invest in rookies and lower dollar talent can do really well and succeed. So looking at the names on the roster shouldn't always automatically tell you how good a team is or isn't. And I think that CLG is a team that has been very good at min-maxing what they can get out of their players. I will, however, say that the players, we have seen kind of the min-max of a lot of the players on the CLG roster. So that's the point where you start to repeat the formula, you take some risks on some academy players and see if you can get something more out of it.
This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Daniel Yordanov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, and Travis Greb, with a special thanks going out to Jerky's Minion. Want teasers for my upcoming content? To ask a question for my monthly AMA? How about taking part in a discussion with me about esports? Or perhaps you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Become a part of the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.